What if the crown didn't just weigh heavy on their heads, but on their hearts? Behind the thrones, beneath the titles, history hides the kind of love stories it wasn't ready to name. Kings who ruled empires while writing love letters to men. Queens whose closest confidants were more than just friends. For centuries, their truths were buried beneath silk, ceremony, and slander. But the rumors never died. Tonight, we open the palace doors and read between the lines. This is the hidden history of 30 LGBT+ kings and queens you were never meant to know. Before we step into the shadows of royal history, take a second to subscribe. It helps this channel keep uncovering the stories they never taught us in school. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila, sunrise in Sao Paulo? I want to know who else is wandering the halls of history with us tonight. 1. King James IV of England. If power corrupts, then James Stuart came pre-seasoned. Born a king, twice crowned, first as James VI of Scotland, then as James I of England, he was fluent in three things: divine right, theological obsession, and flamboyant favoritism. The last of those earned him centuries of side eyes. Official history calls it favoritism. Unofficial history calls it something a little closer to a 17th century situationship wrapped in velvet doublets and handwritten poetry. James's letters to his male courtiers weren't just affectionate, they were intimate. And while modern defenders chalk it up to the flowery language of the time, that's like calling a Shakespearean sonnet a business memo. There are only so many ways to write, "I desire only to live in your embrace," before it stops being a metaphor. Robert Carr was the first of these human mirrors James couldn't stop staring into. A Scottish page who caught the king's eye by literally falling off a horse, Carr became an overnight favourite. The kind of favourite who got a title, a castle, and full access to the king's private chambers. How poetic, how politically destabilising. James made him the Earl of Somerset. The court called him the King's bedfellow, and while Parliament didn't have much legislative control at the time, it had one powerful weapon: gossip. Whispers about James's nighttime company were carried on candle smoke through Westminster Hall, but no matter how sharp the murmurs, James sharpened his affection even more. "Whether I live or die," he wrote Carr, "I am ever yours, only yours." Eventually, Robert Carr became inconvenient. Scandal stuck to him like wax to parchment, and James, like any self-preserving monarch, adapted. Enter George Villiers, later the Duke of Buckingham. Tall, charismatic, devastatingly well-dressed, and critically not yet embroiled in murder investigations. James fell hard. By now, he was older, perhaps wiser, but no less emotionally reckless. Villiers, with his perfectly curled hair and suspiciously fast promotions, became something between a royal advisor and emotional crutch. The letters between them read like teenage diaries filtered through the King James Bible. "I desire to live only in your love," James wrote. "I count all else as dung." Yes, dung. Even his metaphors were politically incorrect. This wasn't love in the way we now categorize it. It was courtly, coded, and complicated by power. James was married to Anne of Denmark and had children, but royal marriages were rarely about affection. In contrast, his relationships with Carr and Villiers had texture, jealousy, longing, obsession, and poetic despair. It's the emotional architecture of these bonds, not the physical specifics, that leaves historians squirming, because feelings are harder to disprove than facts. Of course, James denied any scandal. "I am not ashamed of my love," he insisted. But even that honesty is slippery. Was he protesting too much? Or did he simply have no modern context for the kind of love he felt? In a time when men routinely kissed on the cheek and shared beds without raising eyebrows, where does affection end and desire begin? James's reign was filled with contradictions. A man obsessed with the Bible who also rewrote it. A peacemaker who bred discontent. A ruler who demanded obedience but couldn't resist vulnerability. His legacy is just as tangled. Today, the King James Bible bears his name. But so quietly do centuries of unspoken questions about the nature of male intimacy, royal loneliness, and how history sanitizes desire with the word favoritism. James died with Villiers still in favor. The man he called his sweet child and wife was by his side. And whether or not they crossed the threshold from emotional to physical, what lingers is something far more unnerving. A monarch unafraid to love men openly in letters while ruling over a country that preferred its kings to be stoic, not smitten. But what if a ruler didn't just write poetry to men? What if she abdicated her throne for the freedom to do so? Let's turn our gaze northward, toward a queen who wore men's clothing, signed her letters with kisses, and redefined what it meant to rule alone. 2. Queen Christina of Sweden. If you believe monarchs were born to follow rules, you haven't met Christina of Sweden. She came into the world wrapped in contradiction, a queen who refused to be a woman, a ruler who refused to rule the way anyone expected, and a scholar who treated power like an inconvenient detail in a much larger philosophical puzzle. Christina was born in 1626, the only surviving legitimate child of King Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden's warrior king. When he died in battle, his 6-year-old daughter inherited not only the throne but also the burden of living up to a myth. The court expected her to be a dutiful queen. Instead, they got someone who dressed like a man, swore like a soldier, and collected philosophers like other people collected jewels. Sweden wanted a monarch. Christina wanted a mind. Her court became a salon of ideas, filled with mathematicians, theologians, and scientists. She invited René Descartes to Stockholm, though the philosopher soon froze to death in the northern cold, a poetic casualty of intellectual ambition. Christina didn't mourn long. She was too busy dismantling the decorum of royalty, one witty insult at a time. The Queen refused to marry. That in itself wasn't unprecedented, but her reasoning was almost radical. She wrote, "Marriage is a necessary evil. I will not subject myself to it." In a Europe where queens were expected to produce heirs like clockwork, this sounded like a declaration of war. Then came Ebba Sparre, a countess, a lady-in-waiting, and, depending on which historian you ask, the love of Christina's life. The Queen called her my bedfellow, my darling, and the one I love above all others. In letters, Christina's affection dances between courtly admiration and unmistakable tenderness. She wrote with the kind of passion that doesn't need to be decoded. To one friend, she described Ebba as beautiful, witty, and entirely my heart. Some modern historians caution against labeling Christina through today's categories. Fair, but you can't help noticing the pattern, the intensity, the poetry, the defiance. If her affection for men was political, her affection for Ebba was personal. There's a difference between using someone for power and writing them love notes sealed in wax. But Christina's rebellion ran deeper than her heart. She rejected her crown itself. In 1654, at the height of her reign, she abdicated, citing exhaustion, faith, and freedom. She rode out of Stockholm dressed in men's clothes, her hair cropped short, her demeanor almost gleeful. The people were stunned. Queens were supposed to die in power or childbirth, not in voluntary exile. Christina simply waved, muttered something about divine inspiration, and left Sweden behind. She converted to Catholicism in Rome, shocking Protestant Europe. The Vatican, unsure what to make of this cross-dressing ex-queen who debated cardinals and collected art, tolerated her. Like an eccentric relative at dinner, Christina spent her later years wandering the intellectual salons of Europe, part philosopher, part enigma, part self-invented myth. Her sexuality, like her politics, was a kind of rebellion. She refused the binary expectations of her era, king or queen, woman or man, sinner or saint. She was all and none. Her story isn't just about attraction, it's about autonomy. The radical notion that a ruler might abdicate not for love nor for scandal, but for the right to define herself on her own terms. Even centuries later, Christina leaves historians fidgeting. Was she a lesbian, bisexual, gender non-conforming, or simply a mind too large for the categories available in the 17th century? Whatever the answer, her defiance still echoes. The first monarch to trade power for identity, to write her own myth before anyone else could. And yet, for all her eccentricities, Christina's story is almost tame compared to the one that came next. A king whose passion for his male favourites didn't just stir whispers, but sparked rebellion, imprisonment, and perhaps one of the most scandalous downfalls in medieval Europe. If you're still with us after Queen Christina's scandalous exits and whispered letters, you're exactly the kind of curious soul this channel was made for. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it on your end? Is it late night curiosity or early morning rebellion? Let's see who else is up unraveling royal secrets. 3. King Edward II of England. Some monarchs are remembered for conquest, others for lawmaking. Edward II, he's mostly remembered for getting too close to another man. Born in 1284, Edward was the first English prince to hold the title Prince of Wales, but by the time he took the throne in 1307, the weight of kingship sat awkwardly on his shoulders. He preferred music to military drills, commoners to courtiers, and most controversially, Piers Gaveston to nearly everyone else. Gaveston was more than just a companion. He was a young Gascon knight, handsome, witty, and completely out of place among England's brooding barons, and yet Edward elevated him again and again, lavishing titles, lands, and private time upon him, all while the nobility fumed. The two were inseparable. Chroniclers at the time, not known for subtlety, described their bond in almost romantic terms. One even wrote that Edward loved him beyond measure. That might seem tame by modern standards, but in 14th century England it was enough to ignite political fury. The barons didn't just dislike Gaveston, they despised what he represented. Unchecked influence by a man who hadn't earned it by blood, battle, or bureaucracy. Whether Edward and Gaveston's relationship was romantic, emotional, or something else entirely is still debated. What isn't debated is the intensity. Edward showered him with gifts, referred to him in court documents as his brother, and gave him titles traditionally reserved for nobility, not favourites. When Parliament tried to banish Gaveston, Edward dug in his heels. This wasn't just about politics anymore, it was personal. The fallout came swiftly. Gaveston was exiled multiple times, only to be brought back by a defiant Edward. Eventually, the barons had had enough. In 1312, a group of them captured Gaveston and executed him. Edward was devastated. His mourning was conspicuous, far more intense than anything he showed for fallen nobles or family. The country watched a king mourn a man they insisted was just a friend, but clearly wasn't just anything. In Gaveston's absence, Edward found a new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston had irritated the barons, Despenser positively enraged them. He wasn't just close to Edward, he inserted himself into royal politics with venom. Land seizures, petty feuds, and overt manipulation of the king followed. Once again, England found itself ruled not by a monarch, but by the gravitational pull of a single court favourite. The Despensers, father and son, brought the country to the brink of civil war. By 1326, Queen Isabella, Edward's long-suffering wife, had allied with her lover Roger Mortimer and launched a full invasion of England. Edward was captured and forced to abdicate in favour of his son. Despenser was executed. Edward, stripped of his crown, was imprisoned, the first English king to be deposed since the Norman conquest. What happened next? That part is filled with whispers, rumours, and theatrical embellishments, the kind of stories that mix fact with propaganda. But one truth remains. Edward's reign unravelled because he kept choosing love, or at least loyalty, in the wrong places and the wrong faces as far as the English nobility were concerned. Still, it's worth asking, What terrified the nobles more, the political influence of a favorite or the emotional intimacy between two men that threatened to eclipse dynastic duty? With Edward, power and affection weren't just intertwined, they were indistinguishable. And while his reign ended in disgrace, it set a precedent. The court favorite as political flashpoint, emotional mirror, and national crisis. But Edward wasn't the last monarch to elevate a man so high it shook the state. In fact, the next one made it a philosophy, hiding philosophy inside affection, and affection behind a wall of Enlightenment wit and powdered wigs. 4. King Frederick the Great of Prussia. Frederick the Great didn't want to be great, at least not in the way his father defined it. Born in 1712 into the cold, rigid arms of Prussian militarism, young Frederick was meant to be a machine, disciplined, Protestant, obedient, and above all, emotionless. His father, King Frederick William I, the so-called Soldier King, ran the royal household like a barracks and treated his son like a failed recruit. Frederick, in turn, responded like any over-controlled prodigy might, by falling in love with art, philosophy, French literature, and as some suggest, a boy named Hans Hermann von Katter. Katter was more than just a fellow officer. He was the one person in Frederick's suffocating world who seemed to understand him. Older, charming, and fluent in the same Enlightenment ideals that made the Prussian court shiver with suspicion, Katter and Frederick became inseparable. They read poetry together, played music, exchanged secret letters. They also plotted an escape, literally, when Frederick tried to flee Prussia for the more liberal court of Britain, where he hoped to study, breathe, and maybe live with a little less surveillance. The plan failed. His father had them arrested. What followed wasn't just punishment, it was a carefully staged trauma. Frederick was imprisoned, Katter was executed, and the king made sure his son watched. From that point forward, something shifted. Frederick emerged colder, more calculating, and strangely compliant. He married, as expected, though he never spent a single night with his wife and lived apart from her for their entire marriage. He took the throne, he wore the uniform, he became great, but it was a greatness filtered through repression and precision. Frederick the Great built Prussia into a European power, won wars against Austria, and terrified every chancellor from Vienna to Versailles. But behind the military campaigns and political reforms was a man who surrounded himself almost exclusively with male companions. His inner circle, generals, artists, philosophers, were carefully selected, intensely loyal, and by some accounts, emotionally entangled. He maintained a lifelong correspondence with the French philosopher Voltaire, much of it steeped in flirtatious wit. He decorated his palaces with statues of Greek gods, commissioned art that celebrated male beauty, and kept private rooms filled with romantic poetry in multiple languages. And yet, he never publicly acknowledged any romantic or sexual relationship with anyone, male or female. Historians have long speculated about Frederick's sexuality. Some argue it's clear he was a gay man forced into a political performance of heterosexuality. Others insist he was simply ascetic, a stoic who rejected personal indulgence. But the records hint otherwise. His letters, heavily edited after his death, once contained passages of aching vulnerability towards specific men. Even his will reflects this private intensity. He requested to be buried next to his beloved dogs, the only companions who never disappointed him. Frederick ruled for over 4 decades, rarely smiled in public, and lived mostly in male company at his private estate of Sans Souci, a name that means without worries. But the irony is hard to miss. For a man who transformed Prussia into a model of efficiency and reason, his own life was quietly haunted by emotion he was never allowed to express. And so, the legend of Frederick the Great remains neatly preserved, the philosopher king, the military genius, the aloof bachelor. But beneath the marble statues and powdered wigs is a far more human mystery, a life forever shaped by the loss of a single man, and a nation forever ruled by someone who learned early that to feel too much was to risk everything. Of course, Frederick hid his longing in letters and architecture. The next figure didn't bother hiding at all. His passions were sung across battlefields and carved into monuments. Because when you're Alexander the Great, you don't ask for permission to love, you simply conquer. 5. Alexander the Great of Macedon. Alexander the Great didn't just conquer empires, he conquered mythology. By the time he was 30, he'd overthrown the Persian Empire, marched his armies from Greece to the edge of India, and founded over 20 cities that bore his name. The man didn't just build history, he insisted on becoming legend. But even in the haze of war stories and propaganda, one name keeps echoing alongside his own: Hephaestion, his general, his closest companion, his mirror. Born in 356 BCE, Alexander grew up in a world shaped by gods and epic poetry, where men proved themselves on the battlefield and in the company of other men. In Macedonian aristocracy, same-sex relationships weren't taboo, as long as they didn't get in the way of marriage, heirs, or duty. Still, Alexander's bond with Hephaestion stood apart. It wasn't just affectionate, it was foundational. The two were raised together, educated under Aristotle, trained to lead. When Alexander became king, Hephaestion was never far behind. He was promoted not only as a military commander, but as a kind of emotional second-in-command, someone who wasn't just trusted, but revered. Ancient writers compared their bond to Achilles and Patroclus, whose love was once sung by Homer himself. And when ancient sources start drawing mythic parallels, you know something real, or at least meaningful, was happening. Alexander called Hephaestion Philolexandros, the one who loves Alexander. Not metaphorically, not politically, personally. At the funeral of Achilles, Hephaestion laid a wreath. Later, at his own funeral, Alexander declared national mourning. He refused food, he shaved his head, he demanded Hephaestion be worshipped as a divine hero, and in Babylon, where Alexander would die just 8 months later, he ordered a monumental pyre, taller than any building in the city, to burn in his friend's honor. Was it romantic? Sexual? The ancient world didn't always separate those categories the way we do. What mattered wasn't the labels, but the devotion. Alexander had wives, political marriages mostly, but none left a mark the way Hephaestion did. None inspired mourning that shut down an empire. This wasn't just grief, it was identity. Alexander saw Hephaestion not as a subject or servant, but as a second self. When Hephaestion died, something in Alexander fractured. The man who had marched across continents suddenly slowed. His military campaigns became erratic. His letters stopped flowing. The god-king who had once named himself son of Zeus began to look eerily mortal. The emotional center of one of the most ambitious empires in history wasn't just strategy or ambition, it was companionship, maybe even love. And the tragedy of Alexander's story is not that he died young, but that the person who may have grounded him didn't live to see what came next. Still, Alexander's grief wasn't the end of the world. It was just another empire to rule alone. And yet, for another emperor who ruled across deserts instead of rivers, the loss of a beloved didn't just break his heart, it became divine law. Because when Hadrian lost Antinous, he didn't just mourn, he made him a god. 6. Emperor Hadrian of Rome. Hadrian was the kind of Roman emperor who loved borders, drawing them, crossing them, fortifying them. His name survives in stone, most famously in the wall that still slices across northern England like an ancient scar, Hadrian's Wall, a declaration that Rome ended here and barbarians began there. But for all his obsession with boundaries, there was one line Hadrian never cared to observe. The one between ruler and lover, public grief and private worship, man and myth. Enter Antinous, a Greek youth from Bithynia with little political power, but a face that would eventually rival the gods. Antinous met Hadrian when the emperor was touring the eastern provinces. He was young, probably in his late teens, quiet, graceful, and magnetic in the way that some people are before history reshapes them. Hadrian took him into his traveling court. But court is too formal a word. It was more of a roving empire on horseback, staffed with philosophers, soldiers, and one increasingly prominent companion who stayed at Hadrian's side through years of travel. Antinous was no passive ornament. Ancient sources suggest he was educated, trusted, and even initiated into the emperor's private religious rites, the kind of rituals emperors didn't share lightly. What exactly their relationship was, romantic, emotional, ceremonial, has fueled centuries of speculation. Roman historians, most of them writing well after the fact, were often vague, dismissive, or uncomfortable. Roman masculinity, after all, came with its own moral accounting system. A powerful man could take lovers, but affection was supposed to be controlled, unspoken, utilitarian. Hadrian broke that rule. In 130 CE, while the imperial entourage floated down the Nile, Antinous drowned. The circumstances remain mysterious. Some say accident, some say ritual sacrifice, others whisper darker possibilities. Hadrian, already in his 50s, unraveled. This wasn't just mourning, it was canonization. He named an entire city after Antinous, Antinopolis, built on the spot where his body washed ashore. Statues of the youth sprang up across the empire, more than of any mortal figure save Augustus himself. Coins were minted with his image. Temples were built. Priests were ordained. Hadrian didn't just grieve, he declared Antinous a god. For the next years of his reign, Hadrian surrounded himself with reminders, busts, poems, cults, not quietly, not in shame, publicly, officially. The Roman Senate was uneasy. The gods were not meant to look like teenage boys with soft eyes and perfectly curled hair, but Hadrian didn't ask permission. He carved Antinous into history, one temple at a time. It wasn't just an emperor's heartbreak. It was a restructuring of imperial identity. Antinous became a symbol of beauty, death, and mysterious rebirth, a kind of pagan martyr with marble skin and divine silence. And Hadrian, stoic no more, became the architect of a new mythology, one where love outlasted life and memory outlived empire. Of course, this wasn't the first time a ruler blurred the line between devotion and spectacle. But where Hadrian deified his beloved, the next monarch simply surrounded himself with them, powdered, perfumed, and provocatively close. Because in the French court of Henri III, favoritism was fashion and scandal was the official language. 7. King Henri III of France. In the ornate hallways of late 16th century France, where daggers hid behind lace cuffs and theology mingled with perfume, Henri III reigned as something of a living contradiction. Crowned with Catholic expectation, but dressed like a libertine angel, Henri's rule was a balancing act between devotion and decadence, severity and scandal, and at the centre of that scandal stood his infamous circle of male favourites, the mignons. Henri was the last of the Valois kings, and he wore that crown like a man who knew the curtain was already falling. Born in 1551, Henri ascended the throne in 1574, after a stint as the elected King of Poland, a job he promptly abandoned to race back to France when his brother died. Europe's courts had seen eccentric kings before, but Henri's entrance brought a new kind of drama. He was intelligent, pious, and politically astute, but what the nobles and the public noticed most was his aesthetic. He powdered his face, he wore earrings, he adored scented gloves, elaborate brocades, and long pearl necklaces. He fasted for days, then feasted like a sybarite. He wandered barefoot through cathedrals in holy ecstasy, then through lavish balls the next night. And always there were the mignons. The term itself meant darling or cutie in French, a detail the king seemed entirely comfortable with. These young, beautifully dressed courtiers trailed Henri like a cloud of cologne and controversy. He bestowed them with titles, lands, and extravagant gifts. They wore their hair long and curled, their swords jewelled, their expressions carefully indifferent. To the public, they weren't just suspicious, they were enraging. The nobility seethed at the power these untested young men wielded. The Protestant pamphleteers had a field day, accusing the king of effeminacy, moral corruption, and worse. Henri was mocked in woodcuts, sermons, and street songs. If he noticed, he didn't flinch. But what was the nature of these relationships? That's the eternal murmur. Henri never married, though he was briefly engaged. His affection for the mignons was visible. He kissed them in public, held hands, even wept openly when one was wounded. Letters between them overflowed with flattery and fondness. Were these emotional attachments, political alliances, or something more romantic? Likely all three. In an era where male intimacy lived in a cultural grey zone, Henri seemed to step into that ambiguity without hesitation. He spiritualized affection, cloaked it in religious ritual, and wrapped it in silk. As civil wars tore France apart, Henri clung to his court, theatrical, loyal, perfumed, and oddly insulated. While blood ran in the streets between Catholics and Huguenots, the king floated through his gilded salons, surrounded by beauty and whispers. Henri would die childless, assassinated in 1589 by a Catholic zealot. His legacy remains split, saintly to some, scandalous to others. But beneath the rumors and reactionary panic was a monarch who dared to embody contradiction, sacred and sensual, ascetic and extravagant, both king and something more tender. Still, for all Henri's powdered poise and velveted ambiguity, he wasn't the only Roman Catholic ruler to bend the gender script. Just ask Nero, the emperor who didn't just love men, but married them, crowned them, and called it divine order. 8. Emperor Nero of Rome. If Rome was ever a stage, Nero wasn't just its emperor. He was its lead actor, playwright, costume designer, and fire marshal, apparently. Born in 37 CE and crowned at just 16, Nero ruled an empire and performed in it too, often literally. His public love of theatre, music, and performance scandalized the Senate, but it was his private life, or more accurately, his lack of discretion about it, that etched him into scandalous eternity. By Roman standards, emperors could be eccentric. They could even be cruel. But Nero was something else entirely. He made public spectacles of private rituals, broke social codes like cheap amphorae, and most memorably reimagined marriage itself, twice, with men. First came Pythagoras. No, not the triangle guy. A freedman who Nero married in a formal Roman ceremony. The roles were reversed. Nero wore the veil, played the bride, and declared his devotion with all the pomp of a traditional wedding. The court gawked, the senators gossiped, but Nero, he glided through it like he was reciting lines from a play he'd written himself. Then came Sporus, a young boy said to resemble Nero's deceased wife, Poppaea. After Poppaea's death, under mysterious and debatably accidental circumstances, Nero found in Sporus a kind of eerie echo. He had the boy castrated and married him too, this time with Nero taking the groom's role. Sporus was dressed in women's clothing, adorned in royal jewelry, and paraded through public functions as empress. Even in Rome, a culture surprisingly permissive by ancient standards, this rattled people. Historians, many of them writing under emperors who hated Nero, portrayed these marriages as grotesque parodies. But that may say more about their discomfort than Nero's intent. Was it performative blasphemy, emotional compulsion, or simply a ruler wielding absolute power to rewrite reality according to his imagination? Nero's rule wasn't all theatre. There were administrative reforms, artistic patronage, and a complex foreign policy. But none of that made it into the popular memory. What people remembered was the burning of Rome, which he likely didn't cause, his musical performances during disasters, which he definitely insisted on, and the lavish weddings to men that blurred every line Roman society had drawn. He wasn't just loving men, he was elevating them, ritualizing them, and redefining imperial identity around them. And yet, unlike Hadrian's mournful deification of Antinous, Nero's partnerships carried a tone of theatrical self-indulgence. These weren't elegies, they were statements. His reign ended in chaos, rebellion, and exile. He took his own life in 68 CE, declaring, "What an artist dies in me." History naturally debated whether that was tragedy or comedy. Still, for all of Nero's flamboyance and public unions, he was far from alone in his preferences. The throne of England, generations later, would see another ruler whose reign echoed with similar rumours, one who shunned marriage, adored fashion, and surrounded himself with beautiful boys in silk. His name? William Rufus. But history remembered him as the Red King, and the mystery of his court was painted in crimson. 9. King William II, Rufus of England. William II of England, better known as William Rufus or the Red King, ruled from 1087 to 1100, a reign short on charm but long on scandal. His nickname is sometimes attributed to his ruddy complexion, other times to his fiery temper. But in hindsight, it might just as easily have referred to the colour of embarrassment painted across the faces of his conservative Anglo-Norman court. William inherited the English throne from his father, William the Conqueror, a man whose legacy was carved in blood and bureaucracy. His elder brother took Normandy, William got England. What followed was a reign defined not by laws or expansion, but by tensions between church and crown, nobles and king, and more quietly, between what William did publicly and what no one dared to say aloud. Chroniclers didn't like him, that's putting it mildly. The medieval historians who recorded his life had two dominant moods: disapproval and dread. They called him irreligious, arrogant, profane, greedy, and those were just the polite adjectives. But hidden among the theological rants and political criticisms was another thread: the Red King's peculiar taste in companionship. He never married, he had no known mistresses, he fathered no children, a conspicuous absence for a medieval monarch. His court, by contrast, was filled with handsome young men. They dressed extravagantly, wore their hair fashionably long, and enjoyed a level of favour that made barons grit their teeth and clergy mutter sermons under their breath. The monk Orderic Vitalis, never one to skip a juicy rumour, noted that the king surrounded himself with effeminate youths in extravagant clothes and showed scorn for the chastity of religion. The criticism, wrapped in piety, drips with implication. William's personal tastes weren't just questioned, they were weaponized, and while none of the chroniclers came out and used modern terms, their tone left little room for misinterpretation. There are no surviving love letters, no private diaries, just a growing pile of pointed observations, court rumors, and the cultural expectation that a king should marry, produce heirs, and behave like a proper warrior king. William Rufus did none of these things. Instead, he paraded his independence, mocked the clergy, wore his crown defiantly, and kept company that scandalized both monk and noble. His death, sudden, mysterious, and strangely convenient, only deepened the intrigue. He was shot with an arrow during a hunting expedition in the New Forest, an accident that conveniently placed his younger brother Henry on the throne. The archer fled. The body was abandoned by his hunting party. Officially, it was labelled an unfortunate mishap. Unofficially, it was treated like a political cleansing. William's burial was quiet. No national mourning, no royal tomb fit for a king, and yet, centuries later, his story lingers, not because of laws passed or wars fought, but because of what remains unsaid. The Red King, with his silken courtiers and conspicuous solitude, challenges the neat categories of medieval masculinity and royal decorum. He left no heirs, no confessions, and no apologies. But history never needed permission to whisper, and it would whisper again, this time in Bavaria, where another king would live among fairy tale castles, romantic obsessions, and a growing desire to retreat entirely from the world of reality. His name, Ludwig II, and his kingdom, half real, half dream. 10. King Ludwig II of Bavaria. If ever a monarch seemed more suited to myth than rule, it was Ludwig II of Bavaria, the king who built castles for imaginary kings, wrote letters like love poems to composers, and all but floated above the muddy politics of 19th century Europe. He was born in 1845, destined for the throne and disinterested in almost everything that came with it, except for music, moonlight, and men he could never quite name out loud. Ludwig didn't want power. He wanted beauty, and beauty to him was not found in statecraft or war, but in Wagnerian opera, medieval romance, and the unspoken intimacy of long glances and long walks with male companions through foggy alpine meadows. He ascended the throne at just 18, tall, delicate, dreamy, and immediately began ruling more like a poet than a prince. His government complained he was unreachable. His ministers despaired at his refusal to marry, but Ludwig's affections were already spoken for, in letters that reveal a world of inner longing, aesthetic obsession, and emotional devotion. At the center of much of this was Richard Wagner, the controversial composer whose operas Ludwig revered like scripture. When the king met Wagner, it was like meeting a god. He paid the composer's debts, built him theaters, funded entire productions. Their correspondence reads less like royal patronage and more like devotional verse, Ludwig writing of sacred moments and unutterable love. But it wasn't just Wagner. Ludwig surrounded himself with male companions, actors, servants, soldiers, men whose company he cherished in private and whose presence he protected in public. His diaries, heavily redacted after his death, suggest deep emotional attachments. The tone is vulnerable, even tortured, a man at war with feelings he could not express without consequence. His castles, too, became expressions of longing. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, architectural odes not to Bavaria, but to Ludwig's imagination, each one more removed from reality, more dreamlike, more self-contained. These were not homes, they were worlds, and in these worlds Ludwig reigned as he wished, free from court expectations, moral scrutiny, and the constant pressure to explain himself. Of course, the court grew restless. Ministers began questioning his sanity. His spending was extravagant, his isolation extreme. In 1886, they moved against him. Without a trial, without even a hearing, Ludwig was declared insane by a panel of doctors who had never examined him. Days later, he was dead, drowned in shallow water under mysterious circumstances, along with the psychiatrist who had signed his diagnosis. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, a tragedy too poetic to be coincidence. The mad king of Bavaria, undone not by war, but by loneliness, by fantasy, by a love that had no safe harbor in his century. Ludwig left no heirs, but he left silhouettes, painted in fresco, carved in stone, and written between the lines of redacted pages. His life was a symphony interrupted. And yet, compared to the next ruler, a pharaoh whose love story is buried beneath millennia of silence, even Ludwig's dream world feels well documented. Because when it comes to Pepi Dico, we're left with only shadows, footsteps in sand, and one tantalizing story that refuses to die. 11. Pharaoh Pepi II of Egypt. The deeper you dig into history, the fainter the voices become, and by the time you reach the sands of ancient Egypt's 6th dynasty, you're mostly listening to echoes. But every now and then, an echo sounds suspiciously like a whisper, and in the case of Pharaoh Pepi II, that whisper is wrapped in nightfall, secrecy, and an unexpected nightly visit. Pepi II, ruler of Egypt for what some claim to be the longest reign in world history, possibly over 90 years, is remembered less for grand conquests or monumental building projects, and more for surviving time itself. He became pharaoh as a child, around 6 years old, and ruled well into old age. But in the fragments of text left behind, in particular, a curious tale found in an ancient papyrus, we find a mystery far more intimate than any temple inscription. The story goes like this. Every night, under cover of darkness, Pepi II would send for his general, a man named Sassanet. The tale is recorded in a text known as the Magical Papyrus of Turin, a document filled with stories that blur the line between myth and memory. It reads almost like a bedtime fable for adults. The king, filled with desire, would call upon Sassanet, who would come at his command. The nature of these visits, unspoken, their frequency, nightly, the implication left just vague enough to stir 3,000 years of speculation. Some scholars insist it's merely a metaphor, a literary flourish, maybe even an allegorical tale about loyalty or service. Others argue the subtext is not subtle at all. After all, ancient Egyptian literature wasn't shy when it wanted to be. So why the ambiguity here? Part of the intrigue is that Egypt, unlike many later civilizations, didn't codify sexual behavior into strict moral binaries. Relationships were complex, status-based, and often veiled in ritual language. What mattered was hierarchy, not orientation. A pharaoh's desires weren't subject to public morality. They were above it, wrapped in divine authority. Which is perhaps why no one dared write the full truth plainly. Still, the nightly nature of the tale, the secrecy and the role of Sassanit, a trusted military leader, paints a picture that suggests more than routine business. In a court driven by protocol and daylight, these nightly summons feel deliberately private, and in the centuries since, they've become something else, a doorway into how affection, desire, or companionship may have existed in forms we'll never fully decode. Pepi II's tomb, unlike the pyramids of his forebears, was modest. His legacy, likewise, is quiet, less carved in stone than scattered in papyri and suggestion. But perhaps that's the point. Not every ruler's truth was meant for sunlight. Some stories were built to survive in shadows. And if the faintness of Pepi's tale leaves us guessing, the next king on our path leaves even less, his secrets tucked beneath poetic letters, whispered compliments, and the veiled elegance of a court where affection wore armor. Henri of Navarre may have ruled with political savvy, but when it came to companionship, his heart may have wandered somewhere altogether softer. 12. King Henri II of Navarre. History tends to remember King Henri II of Navarre as a monarch caught between worlds, between Catholic and Protestant, France and Spain, duty and desire. But hidden beneath the diplomacy and dynastic obligations lies another kind of balancing act, less discussed but no less persistent. The delicate choreography of male affection, courtly intimacy, and the ambiguous nature of his relationships with the young men who moved in his orbit like favored stars. Henri ruled Navarre, a small but symbolically powerful kingdom nestled in the Pyrenees, from 1517 until his death in 1555. Though often overshadowed by his more famous daughter, Jeanne d'Albret, and grandson Henry IV of France, Henri II had a reign of quiet intrigue. A patron of the arts and a politically cautious reformer, he often wrote in poetic language, and that's where the trail begins, not in scandal, but in verse. Within the carefully curated records of Henri's reign lie personal letters and notes that hint at emotional entanglements with his male favourites. These weren't brazen affairs or whispered scandals, at least not in the way later monarchs would stir gossip, but rather slow, smouldering connections veiled in the formal language of chivalry and courtliness. One such favourite was a young nobleman named Jean de Lasserre, whose closeness to the king drew the attention of courtiers and chroniclers alike. Henri showered him with praise and influence, placing him in powerful roles with little objection, except from those quietly measuring the distance between flattery and favoritism. The letters between them, preserved in fragments, read less like political correspondence and more like coded declarations. Longing cloaked in formality, attachment concealed beneath the armor of etiquette. Henri often referred to Lasserre with language reserved for lovers in the poetry of the time, terms of endearment, metaphors of loyalty and heartbreak, and subtle insinuations of a bond deeper than mere allegiance. Was it romantic, emotional, an exaggerated friendship by our standards, or something more tangible by theirs? The line, as usual, refuses to stay fixed. In a court culture shaped by performance, manners, and the literary stylings of troubadours, love could hide in plain sight, so long as it followed the script. Henri eventually married Margaret of Angoulême, sister of King Francis I of France, a politically strategic match. Their union was intellectually rich but largely symbolic. Margaret herself was a celebrated writer and philosopher, one of the first notable women of the French Renaissance. If she noticed Henri's emotional investments elsewhere, she gave no public sign. Perhaps she understood the game, perhaps she played it herself. Henri died in 1555, passing a kingdom on the brink of religious upheaval to his daughter. His legacy remains restrained, a king who chose diplomacy over dogma, poetry over posturing. But his letters, still faint with feeling, leave open a question that no historian can conclusively answer. Where does admiration end and affection begin? And that uncertainty, that blurred line, would echo across the continent, all the way to Han China, where an emperor would leave behind a single story, one sleeve, and a metaphor so enduring it would define a culture's way of understanding same-sex love for over 2,000 years. 13. Emperor Ai of Han China. In the long jade-threaded scroll of Chinese imperial history, the tale of Emperor Ai of Han is a quiet anomaly, not for its politics, which were relatively unremarkable, nor for its wars, which were few. What makes Emperor Ai stand out across dynasties and centuries is a single gesture, a man choosing not to disturb his sleeping lover, and in doing so, creating one of the most enduring metaphors for same-sex love in all of Chinese literature. He ruled briefly from 7 BCE to 1 BCE at the tail end of the Western Han dynasty. Barely in his 20s when he took the throne, Emperor Ai inherited a court riddled with factional tension, ceremonial rigor, and quiet desperation to preserve a crumbling order. Amid the bureaucratic shuffle and dynastic expectation, he formed an intimate bond with a young court official named Dong Xian. Dong was not of particularly noble background. He entered the palace as a low-ranking functionary, but he quickly caught the emperor's attention, and many believe his affection. Whether it was charm, intelligence, or a subtler chemistry, the two became inseparable. Emperor Ai elevated Dong with remarkable speed, granting him titles, land, military command, and most famously, his bed. One morning, the story goes, the emperor woke to find Dong Xian asleep across his sleeve. Rather than disturb him, Ai cut the sleeve off entirely and slipped away silently. The court noticed, the story spread, and thus was born the idiom duang xiu, the cut sleeve, a phrase that still serves in modern Mandarin as a poetic reference to male-male love. Unlike many historical rulers whose relationships were veiled in suggestion, Ai's affection for Dong was so public, so blatant, that it became its own political liability. Critics accused Dong of manipulating imperial decisions. The speed and scale of his rise invited suspicion and resentment. But whether their bond was strategic, sincere, or some complex interweaving of the two, it was undeniably consequential. When Emperor Ai died suddenly at the age of 25, the backlash was swift. Dong Xian was stripped of his titles and, facing dishonor, took his own life shortly after. Their brief moment of tenderness, a quiet act of love in a silk-draped palace, had ended in tragedy. But the metaphor endured long after their names faded from official dynastic records. The cut sleeve became more than a phrase. It became a cultural shorthand, used by poets, playwrights, and historians to discuss the undiscussable. In a world that rarely recorded the emotional lives of emperors unless they exploded into scandal, Ai and Dong offered something different, a softness, a decision made in silence, a story that lingered not because it was salacious, but because it was human. And while Ai's legacy may be written in idioms, another king's is etched in armor and crusader legend, a lion-hearted warrior whose battlefield glory was matched only by the intense and ambiguous alliances he forged, particularly with one king of France who seemed a little too close for comfort. 14. King Richard V, the Lionheart of England. In the pantheon of English kings, Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart, looms like a mythic figure, bold, chivalric, war-hardened and canonized in legend. His name evokes images of crusader steel, of galloping horses under the banner of the cross, of epic sieges and lion-emblazoned shields. But beneath the armor and battlefield bravado lies a quieter story, one not taught in school books or etched in stained glass. It's a story about a king who may have loved another king, and whose most intimate alliance remains one of medieval Europe's great unsolved mysteries. Born in 1157 to Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II of England, Richard was every inch the warrior prince. He spent most of his adult life in battle, rarely in England, and even more rarely performing the mundane duties of kingship. His heart, and arguably his truest affections, seemed to lie elsewhere, in the courtly rituals of knighthood, in the bonds of fealty and honour, and perhaps in the company of Philip II of France. The two met as young men, both royal, both ambitious, both products of fiercely competitive dynasties. And yet, what followed was not open hostility, but a strange and unusually tender alliance. They shared campaigns, they shared political goals, and according to some chroniclers, they shared a bed. It's that last detail that has fueled centuries of speculation. According to Roger of Hoveden, a contemporary English chronicler, Richard and Philip ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night the bed did not separate them. In the chivalric code of the time, such closeness could be explained as brotherly affection, a symbol of trust, not intimacy. But then again, not every political alliance involved bed sharing. The chronicler doesn't elaborate, and modern historians have argued both sides. Some see it as courtly custom, others as coded language for a relationship deeper than diplomacy. Richard, notably, never produced a legitimate heir. He married late and under political pressure, and his bride, Berengaria of Navarre, remained largely absent from his life. Their union was childless and by all accounts distant. In 1191, while on the Third Crusade, Richard publicly confessed to an unspecified sin, a vague but dramatic act of penance that some scholars have linked to the morality codes of the time, possibly hinting at a relationship considered unorthodox by the Church. But again, no details were recorded, just the echo of contrition. Richard died in 1199 from a battlefield wound, far from his queen, far from England. He left no direct heir, no lasting dynasty, just a reputation carved from myth and a lingering question. What truly defined the Lionheart's affections? Was it loyalty, strategy, or something more tender and forbidden? Whatever the answer, Richard's emotional landscape remains armoured in ambiguity. But if his legend was shaped on the battlefield, the next king's was shaped in silence, a monarch whose private life unfolded in whispers, accusations, and bedroom doors that never seemed to open to his queen. From battle-hardened glory to courtly withdrawal, King Umberto I of Italy was a man surrounded by secrets. 15. King Umberto I of Italy. At first glance, King Umberto I of Italy looked every bit the 19th century monarch. With his signature moustache, military medals, and stiff Prussian posture, he seemed cut from the same cloth as his European counterparts, a man built for duty, tradition, and the constant grind of statecraft. But behind the ceremonial uniform and somber portraits was a ruler whose private life cast a long, unresolved shadow over his otherwise tightly buttoned legacy. Born in 1844, Umberto grew up during the birth pangs of modern Italy. He was the son of Victor Emmanuel II, the first king of a unified Italy, and inherited both a throne and a complex national identity, stitched together from a patchwork of city-states, royal houses, and revolutionary ideals. When he took the crown in 1878, the nation expected stability. What they got was a king who performed his public role with near mechanical efficiency, and whose personal relationships remained quietly peculiar. His marriage to Queen Margherita, yes, the one for whom the pizza was named, was royal in form, but cold in practice. They had one child, Crown Prince Victor Emmanuel III, and then, silence. The couple maintained appearances, but the emotional distance was striking. Rumors quickly filled the void. Italian court society buzzed with whispers about Umberto's close relationships with certain male military officers. These weren't just aides or bodyguards. They were described as unusually devoted, given generous attention, and in some cases, long-standing access to the king's private chambers. One name in particular, a dashing cavalry officer whose presence was conspicuously constant, recurs in unofficial histories, though concrete documentation is predictably scarce. It's important to note that Italy in the late 19th century was undergoing profound change. Industrialization, modernization, and a growing tension between monarchy and democracy. Against this backdrop, the monarchy clung to conservative appearances, even as rumors swirled beneath the surface. For a king to be romantically linked to male companions was dangerous, not necessarily for moral reasons, but for political ones. The image of strength, virility, and dynastic continuity was paramount. Anything that challenged it, even subtly, was viewed as a liability. To this day, Umberto's private life remains a subject of speculation more than scholarship. There are no love letters, no public confessions, only carefully worded gossip from courtiers and diplomatic observers. But the consistency of these whispers and the glaring emotional distance between Umberto and Margherita leaves a space that facts alone can't quite fill. In 1900, Umberto was assassinated by an anarchist, a political act with no connection to his rumored private life, but one that sealed his story in the cold marble of public duty. And yet, when history revisits him, it's not just as a king caught in the crosshairs of radical politics, but as a man who may have lived behind an emotional mask, surrounded by uniforms, protocol, and secrets unspoken. Secrets that would echo eerily through the English court a century earlier, in the quiet lamplight of Kensington Palace, where Queen Anne of Great Britain composed letters not of statecraft, but of longing. 16. Queen Anne of Great Britain. Queen Anne ruled over a kingdom on the brink of transformation, the final monarch of the House of Stuart, the first sovereign of a united Great Britain, and a deeply private woman whose inner world has puzzled historians for centuries. Her reign, from 1702 to 1714, was marked by war, politics, and power struggles, but underneath the weight of nation-building lay a personal life defined by intense attachments, carefully coded letters, and the kind of companionship that blurred the line between friendship and something far more intimate. Born in 1665, Anne lived a life filled with loss. Of her 17 pregnancies, none produced a surviving heir. Her health was poor, her gait was laboured, her emotions, however, ran deep, often deeper than royal protocol allowed. At the heart of Anne's private life were two women, Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, and later Abigail Masham. Both women were her favourites, her confidants, and, if the letters are to be believed, the objects of her deepest affection. Anne and Sarah Churchill's bond began in youth and evolved into a relationship of extraordinary closeness. They wrote to each other with emotional intensity, shared pet names. Anne called herself Mrs. Morley and Sarah was Mrs. Freeman, and spoke in tones more suggestive of soulmates than mere friends. Sarah, bold and politically ambitious, wielded enormous influence over Anne for years, shaping appointments, military strategies, and even royal policy. But behind the political maneuvering was something undeniably emotional. Their letters are saturated with longing. In one, Anne wrote, "I hope I shall get a moment or two with you alone. I do long to be with you." For some, this was the sentimental tone of Georgian-era intimacy. For others, it reads as the restrained expression of a queen bound by convention and self-censorship. When their relationship soured, partly due to political tensions, partly because of Sarah's overbearing nature, Anne shifted her affection to Abigail Masham, Sarah's cousin, and, conveniently, her quieter opposite. Abigail was reserved, tactful, and far less threatening to Anne's authority. But if she stirred fewer headlines, she did not stir fewer feelings. The depth of Anne's connection to Abigail provoked Sarah's jealousy and ultimately her downfall. She accused Abigail of seducing the queen and manipulating court affairs, a claim dismissed at the time as political slander, but one that continues to raise eyebrows centuries later. Whether Anne's attachments were romantic in the modern sense is still debated, but it's clear that her emotional life, guarded, consuming, and played out in the soft shadows of candlelit correspondence, mattered deeply to her. These weren't casual friendships. They were the kind of ties that shape decisions, fuel rivalries, and leave lasting impressions in royal memory. Anne died in 1714, alone in a palace, filled with ghosts, children who never lived, friendships turned cold, and secrets tucked neatly away in the royal archives. Her crown passed to a new dynasty, but her letters remained, fragile, yearning, and unreadable only if you choose not to look too closely. Yet if Anne's affections stirred suspicion, the next emperor made no effort to quiet his. He defied not only gender roles, but the empire itself, because Elagabalus of Rome didn't just bend norms, he shattered them, all while wearing a crown and a smile that dared anyone to stop him. 17. Emperor Elagabalus of Rome. Some rulers test the boundaries of tradition. Elagabalus didn't just test them. He ignored, rewrote, and then flamboyantly danced over them in embroidered silk. Crowned Emperor of Rome at just 14, Elagabalus's brief reign from 218 to 222 CE remains one of the most chaotic, bewildering, and morally scandalized chapters in Roman imperial history. And at the heart of all that chaos, gender, power, desire, and a teenager who refused to play by anyone's rules but their own. Born in Syria as Varius Avitus Bassianus, Elagabalus was a high priest of the sun god Elagabal, a deity whose cult centered around rituals, mystery, and dramatic symbolism. When political machinations or divine intervention, depending on your source, elevated the boy priest to emperor, Rome expected a puppet. What they got instead was a cultural shockwave. Almost immediately, Elagabalus began making headlines, or rather papyrus columns, not for military victories, but for their personal life. They rejected Roman religious orthodoxy, promoting their sun god over Jupiter, and insisted on blending Eastern and Roman traditions in a way that scandalized the Senate. But it was their gender expression and intimate relationships that truly lit the rumor mills ablaze. Elagabalus didn't just surround themselves with male lovers, they gave them official titles. One, the charioteer Hierocles, was reportedly referred to as the emperor's husband. Another lover, Zoticus, a renowned athlete, was introduced to the court with pomp and ceremony. Ancient historians, many writing with a clear agenda, describe the emperor's relationships with these men, not as affairs, but as public unions. The emperor also seemed to defy gender expectations in ways that challenge even modern vocabulary. Elagabalus is said to have requested to be referred to as a woman, expressed a desire for surgical transformation, though such accounts may be symbolic or exaggerated, and is reported to have worn women's clothing, wigs and makeup. Whether these actions were deeply spiritual, expressions of gender identity, or acts of deliberate provocation, we'll never know, but the effect was seismic. To Roman elites, already suspicious of youth, foreign origins, and religious unorthodoxy, Elagabalus's court appeared less like a palace and more like a stage. They saw excess, sensuality, and instability. What they perhaps missed was a figure grappling with identity at the highest altitude of power, someone daring to reign not only over an empire, but over their own body, heart, and image. Unsurprisingly, the backlash came swiftly. After only 4 years, Elagabalus was assassinated in a palace coup orchestrated by their own grandmother. The Roman establishment breathed a sigh of relief, erased their statues, and tried to forget. But history, as it often does, remembered anyway. Not just the scandal, but the spectacle of a ruler who dared to live publicly in a world that demanded silence. And if Elagabalus ruled with theatrical flair and spiritual defiance, The next monarch did the opposite, wrapping his secrets in powdered formality and cool reserve. King Gustav III of Sweden didn't announce his preferences. He simply left the room when things got too close. 18. King Gustav III of Sweden. If Elagabalus was all fire and performance, King Gustav III of Sweden was ice and theatre, a man who ruled not with swords or scandals but with masks. Crowned in 1771, Gustav presided over a Sweden teetering between Enlightenment idealism and old aristocratic tension. He dressed like a monarch out of an opera, loved masquerade balls more than military parades, and ruled with a velvet-gloved iron hand. But beneath the powdered wigs and dramatic flair was a private life wrapped in velvet secrecy, one that still invites quiet speculation behind the curtains of history. Gustav was, by all accounts, a cultural king. He founded theatres, wrote plays, championed the arts, and tried to model himself on Louis XIV, though with a colder Scandinavian elegance. He had taste, vision, and a talent for staged appearances. But it wasn't just his affinity for theatre that drew attention, it was his disinterest in certain other royal performances. He married Queen Sophia Magdalena of Denmark as expected, but the marriage was delayed, awkward, and, famously, unconsummated for years. Whispered rumours filled the court. The king was indifferent, the queen was frigid, or perhaps neither was the issue. According to some sources, it took the intervention of the king's own brother and a court noble to orchestrate the long overdue consummation. Even then, their only child, the future Gustav IV Adolf, was born amid intense gossip that the entire event had been a carefully arranged production. Why the delay? Why the disinterest? Some believed Gustav simply had no appetite for physical affection, that he was celibate, even asexual, but others noticed a recurring theme. His closest companions were young male courtiers and artists. He surrounded himself with them, wrote them affectionate letters, and granted them influential roles in his court. His correspondence with certain favourites walks the tightrope between poetic admiration and something more emotionally revealing. To his critics, Gustav was theatrical, effeminate, aloof. To his admirers, he was a philosopher king trapped in a world of brutish politics. Either way, he seemed most comfortable in controlled environments. The theatre stage, the royal salon, the masked ball. Environments where roles could be played, identities tried on, and intimacy could hide behind allegory. His assassination in 1792 at a masquerade ball naturally only added to the myth. Shot by conspirators, he reportedly kept his composure to the end, as if even his death was part of a carefully written drama. Je sens en moi une douleur. I feel within me a pain, he is said to have whispered, ever the performer, ever the poet. Gustav left no obvious scandal, no love letters marked with wax-sealed confessions, but he left a trail of elegant evasions, of missing pieces and careful absences. And sometimes what history omits speaks louder than what it records. But if Gustav III was a king of veils and ambiguity, the next ruler was anything but subtle. Branded the impotent, mocked in court circles, and surrounded by rumours thicker than royal tapestries, King Henry IV of Castile was less a monarch of mystery, and more a monarch defined by the whispers he couldn't escape. 19. King Henry IV of Castile history doesn't often treat monarchs kindly when they don't fit the mould, and in the case of King Henry IV of Castile, it practically sharpened its knives. Nicknamed Henri the Impotent, remembered more for innuendo than governance, Henri ruled from 1454 to 1474, a reign defined less by politics and more by persistent whispers. His life reads like a medieval character study in what happens when a king fails to convince the world that he's behaving like one. Henry was born into the powerful Trastamara dynasty of Castile, cousin to the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, but his story diverged sharply from the dynastic script. Where his relatives ruled with fire and zealotry, Henry drifted, hesitant, eccentric, and often disconnected from the aggressive masculinity expected of a late medieval king. The rumours began early. Henri married Blanca of Navarre, but their union remained childless for 13 years. While that alone could have been chalked up to political misfortune, the court took a darker turn. Accusations began to swirl that Henri was unable or unwilling to consummate the marriage. Eventually, the marriage was annulled on grounds of non-consummation. Blanca claimed she remained a virgin, and though the annulment was couched in courtly language, the implication was blunt: the king couldn't perform. Was it medical, psychological, intentional? History doesn't clarify, but the whispers didn't stop. Henry married again, this time to Joan of Portugal, and in 1462 they had a daughter, Joanna. Yet even her birth failed to end the rumours. Instead, they intensified. Nobles claimed the child was illegitimate, the result of an affair between the Queen and one of Henry's favourites. That favourite, a handsome court official named Beltran de la Cueva. Beltran's rise was swift and conspicuous. Henry bestowed on him titles, gifts, and unprecedented access to court. He was, by all appearances, the king's closest companion, trusted above all others. Whether their relationship was political, emotional, or something more remains unclear. But when the legitimacy of Princess Joanna was challenged, Beltran was instantly named as the suspected father. Joanna herself would later be derisively nicknamed La Beltraneja, a label that would haunt her claim to the throne for the rest of her life. Henry's reign dissolved under the weight of noble rebellion, factional warfare, and public perception. His inability or refusal to conform to expectations of virility and royal authority became his defining flaw in the eyes of contemporaries. Whether he was queer, asexual, physically unable, or simply disinterested in royal theatre is impossible to say. But what remains is the outline of a man who quietly defied every box he was forced into. He died in 1474, leaving behind a daughter who could never escape the question of her father's legitimacy, and a legacy that reminds us how often history confuses power with performance, and performance with truth. And yet, as Henri faded under suspicion and scandal, another young monarch was rising in the cold northern reaches of Scotland, a boy who would later become a king of 2 crowns and 2 courts, and who from an early age seemed far more interested in the company of men than the expectations of kingship. 20. King James VI of Scotland. Long before he became the first monarch to rule both England and Scotland, uniting the crowns in a delicate balancing act of diplomacy and ego, James VI of Scotland was already confusing his courtiers. Born in 1566 and crowned King of Scots at just 13 months old, James grew up in a world of conspiracies, assassinations, and Reformation politics. But even as a boy, his royal instincts were sharpened not just for survival, but for affection, especially toward the young men who would eventually define his private world. Before he became James VI of England, he was James VI, a Scottish king with a bookish mind, a love of theological debate, and a habit of forming intense, emotionally charged bonds with male favourites. These relationships weren't hidden. They were paraded, praised, and defended with a mix of affection and royal authority that left little room for subtlety. His first notable attachment was to Esme Stuart, a French nobleman who arrived at the Scottish court when James was in his early teens. Esme was handsome, polished, and Catholic, which in Calvinist Scotland was enough to start a theological riot. But James was smitten. He showered Stuart with titles, made him Duke of Lennox, and reportedly spent so much time with him that the Scottish lords began to panic. The Protestant nobles accused Stuart of seducing the king, not merely in the political sense, but in the physical one as well. Contemporary accounts, especially from enemies of the crown, describe their relationship as unusually close. One even suggested that James would creep into bed with Lennox for long private conversations. Whether this was euphemism, exaggeration, or reality filtered through scandal, it's clear that their bond went far beyond protocol. When Stuart was forced into exile, under pressure from powerful Presbyterian factions, James was devastated. He wrote emotional letters begging him to return, letters soaked in royal longing and almost adolescent vulnerability. It would be the first of several such entanglements. As James matured, so did his pattern. Male favourites, such as James Hay, Alexander Lindsay, and later George Villiers, rose and fell in his orbit, but the style remained consistent. Fast promotions, personal devotion, and the king's unwavering defence of the relationships, no matter the public cost. James married Anne of Denmark, and they had children. But even Anne remarked, not altogether happily, that the king spent more time with his male companions than with her. She was a political match. They were something else entirely. The king's affections didn't fade as he moved south to claim the English throne. If anything, the pattern solidified, and the rumours travelled with him. But before England would grapple with James of Athey and his famously poetic declarations of love to the Duke of Buckingham, Scotland had already known a boy king who didn't hide his heart, no matter how loudly the preachers shouted. And as James ascended to new heights of power, he would carry this pattern with him, to the English court, to the Parliament, and to a country that wasn't quite ready for a king so emotionally outspoken, especially one whose new subjects would begin whispering about his Dutch favourite, a man named Bentinck, who would soon complicate the legacy of another King William entirely. 21. King William III of England. King William III of England was many things: a seasoned soldier, a Protestant champion, a revolutionary monarch who replaced a Catholic king without spilling a single drop of parliamentary blood. He was also a man so tightly composed, so politically precise, that any deviation from stoic expectation echoed louder than cannon fire. But even in the carefully constructed image of William the Deliverer, one detail never quite settled: his long, intimate relationship with a Dutch nobleman named Hans Willem Bentinck. Born in The Hague in 1650, William of Orange rose to prominence not by birthright alone, but by survival and strategy. Orphaned young, raised in a court dominated by Republican suspicion, William learned early how to cloak emotion in discipline. When he married Mary Stuart, daughter of the Catholic King James II, it was a match of dynastic convenience, a Protestant alliance, not a romance. Theirs was a marriage of mutual respect, not public affection. But long before Mary, there was Bentinck. Hans Willem Bentinck was more than a courtier. He was William's childhood friend, personal confidant, and eventually the man entrusted with his most delicate political missions. He tended to William when he was sick. He slept in the same bed during the prince's convalescence, a detail noted by contemporaries, even if such arrangements were not entirely unusual in 17th century Europe. But the closeness between the two men went far beyond shared blankets. When William crossed the English Channel during the Glorious Revolution of 1688, a calculated invasion that saw King James II flee the country, Bentinck was at his side. Upon securing the throne, William elevated him to Earl of Portland, gave him land, titles, and an intimate place in the royal household. The English elite took notice, and predictably they muttered. In private letters, political opponents speculated on the nature of the king's devotion. Even allies whispered that Bentinck's influence over William seemed more than professional. Was it love? Was it dependence? Or was it simply the king's preference for loyalty over lineage, for a man who knew him before the crown? When Bentinck began to feel threatened by the rise of another royal favourite, Arnold van Keppel, a much younger man, his letters took on a jealous tone. He lamented his declining access to William, the growing coldness in the king's demeanour. And while his frustration could be read as political rivalry, it also reads like something more wounded, more personal. William never publicly addressed the rumours. He governed with quiet rigour, won battles, and outlived his beloved wife Mary, after which he ruled alone, emotionally reserved, but still surrounded by male companions whose closeness always left room for interpretation. He died in 1702, leaving behind a kingdom forever changed, and a personal legacy defined less by scandal than by silence. Yet in that silence, questions remain, lingering like fog over the lowlands he once called home. And while William buried his affections beneath diplomacy and duty, the next emperor's story reaches further back, into a time when affection between men wasn't hidden in letters, but enshrined in poetry. Because in ancient Japan, love could wear a mask or a sword and still be called beautiful. 22. Emperor Akihito of Japan and the Whisper of Wakashudo. Emperor Akihito of Japan was born in 1933 into one of the oldest continuous monarchies on Earth, a dynasty so ancient its origin myth begins with the sun goddess herself. As the 125th Emperor of Japan, Akihito's public life was defined by dignity, tradition, and gentle reform. He married Empress Michiko for love, broke with centuries of imperial precedent by doing so, and symbolized a softer, more human monarchy after the devastation of World War II. And yet, when his name appears on a list like this, it's not because of anything he did, but because of what he inherited. To understand this entry, we need to look not at Akihito himself, but at the cultural lineage he was born into, one where male-male intimacy, particularly within elite institutions like the imperial court and the samurai class, was not merely accepted but ritualized. It was called Wakashudo, literally the way of youths, a formalized tradition in which older male patrons, often warriors or nobles, formed emotional, intellectual, and sometimes romantic bonds with younger male companions. This was not a fringe practice. It was recorded in diaries, celebrated in poetry, even illustrated in artwork that survives in temple scrolls and private collections. These relationships weren't secret. They were structured, often with ethical guidelines, and considered a form of mentorship steeped in aesthetic and moral codes. The goal wasn't just pleasure or companionship, it was refinement, mutual elevation, beauty as an ethic. Several emperors in Japan's medieval and early modern periods were rumored participants, or at least sympathetic observers of this tradition. Emperors like Go-Saga and Go-Murakami appear in court records surrounded by favored male attendants, their relationships described in terms that suggest far more than duty. Letters speak of longing, poems use coded metaphors for moonlight meetings and unspoken affection. By the time Akihito was born, of course, Wakashudo had faded, pushed aside by Meiji-era westernization, wartime militarism, and the rigid gender roles of the modern nation-state. Akihito's reign was marked by transparency, modern love, and a new public image for the emperor as a symbol, not a sovereign. His personal life, by all accounts, reflects a steady, enduring partnership with Empress Michiko. And yet, his inclusion here serves a different purpose. He represents not an individual mystery, but a cultural shadow, the echo of an imperial tradition where affection between men was not scandalous but structured, not hidden but housed within beauty and ritual. It's a reminder that not all royal mysteries are personal. Some are inherited and some are erased, not because they were shameful, but because they no longer fit the script of the present. But in the heart of Europe, another emperor was writing his own script, one filled with art, obsession, and just enough eccentricity to rattle an empire. Emperor Rudolf II wasn't bound by tradition. He bent it, broke it, and occasionally wandered barefoot through it in search of meaning, and maybe something closer to love. 23. Emperor Rudolf II of the Holy Roman Empire. If you opened the doors of Prague Castle in the late 1500s, you wouldn't find an emperor sharpening swords or delivering fiery proclamations. You'd find a laboratory, maybe an astrologer, possibly a court painter attempting to immortalize melancholy, or a small zoo of exotic animals wandering freely through corridors lined with alchemical symbols and ancient maps. This was the world of Emperor Rudolf II, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, king of Hungary, Croatia, and Bohemia, and perhaps one of the strangest, most enigmatic monarchs in European history. Rudolf wasn't like other emperors. He wasn't particularly interested in war or administration. He didn't write passionate speeches or lead cavalry charges. What he did was collect everything. Artists, scientists, astrologers, magicians, dwarves, giraffes, and possibly young men. Born in 1552 into the powerful Habsburg dynasty, Rudolf was raised under the suffocating gaze of religious orthodoxy and dynastic duty. He spent his formative years in the Spanish court, a palace of rigid etiquette and Catholic anxiety, and emerged a deeply introverted, emotionally opaque man. When he became emperor in 1576, he moved the court to Prague, not for political reasons, but to pursue what truly interested him, the mysteries of the universe. And while his obsessive patronage of art and science is well documented, commissioning work from masters like Archimboldo and Tycho Brahe, his personal life remains a locked cabinet of suggestion and rumor. He never married, he never took a queen. He had no acknowledged mistresses, no children. For a man whose every court expense was recorded, his affections were notably absent from the official accounts, but not from the gossip. Contemporary accounts, especially from visiting ambassadors and foreign diplomats, whispered of Rudolf's preference for beautiful young men. His court, already bursting with eccentrics, often revolved around male companions who rose rapidly in influence and then just as rapidly disappeared. The pattern was familiar: attention, elevation, scandal, retreat. One such figure was Wolfgang von Rumpf, a courtier described by observers as unusually close to the emperor, favored in both conversation and quiet presence. Some sources implied effeminacy, others hinted at secrecy. All danced around the obvious without ever quite saying it, but the absence of women in Rudolf's emotional and physical orbit didn't go unnoticed, nor did his increasing isolation. By the final years of his reign, he had retreated almost entirely from public life, barricading himself in his palace surrounded by paintings, philosophers, and men who remained unrecorded but not unnoticed. In 1612, he died alone, removed from power by his own family. His brother took the crown. His collections were scattered, but the mystery of Rudolf remained, painted into surreal portraits, hidden in marginalia, buried in half-finished letters and star charts. And as Rudolf's silent affections dissolved into legend, another king, across the cold northern sea, was stirring his own quiet scandal. Christian VII of Denmark wouldn't hide his heart so much as lose it, tangled in madness, manipulation, and a strange attachment that changed not just a court, but a country. 24. King Christian VII of Denmark. Some kings are remembered for what they built, others for what they broke. King Christian VII of Denmark, crowned in 1766 at the age of just 17, is remembered more than anything for being unraveled. His reign was a study in contrasts, a monarch with absolute power who couldn't command his own mind, and a court governed not from the throne, but from the private relationships that quietly rewrote Danish history. Christian's mental health was fragile from the start. Modern historians believe he may have suffered from schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder, though in the 18th century such things were simply labelled madness. He was brilliant at times, paranoid at others, volatile nearly always. Public ceremonies could overwhelm him. He would drift into strange behaviours, fall into childlike moods, then snap into cruel outbursts. His courtiers tiptoed around him, his ministers managed him. His wife, Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, lived beside him like a political accessory, not a partner. Into this deeply unstable world stepped Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician, philosopher, and as it would turn out, something far more influential. Struensee was brought in to treat Christian's condition, and from there everything changed. At first it was medical, then it became political. Then it became personal. Struensee gained the king's trust in a way no one else could. He was calm, composed, rational, everything Christian was not. He treated the king with dignity rather than fear, and in doing so became indispensable. Christian began to depend on him for daily function. By 1770, Struensee was effectively ruling Denmark, issuing edicts, reforming laws, and reshaping the nation under Enlightenment ideals, all in the king's name. But as the physician's influence grew, so did the rumors. Struensee wasn't just close to Christian, he was always close, in chambers, on journeys, in private retreats where no one else was allowed. The two were said to spend long evenings alone, their conversations uninterrupted, their bond sealed in something more than politics. Letters from courtiers describe a tenderness between them that unsettled the court, not because it was obviously scandalous, but because it was clearly something they didn't understand. It didn't help that Struensee also grew close, perhaps too close, to Queen Caroline Matilda. Some believe this was strategic, a political shield, a useful affair. Others think it was genuine. What's undeniable is that Christian, though king in name, became increasingly peripheral in his own marriage and his own rule. In 1772, the backlash came. A palace coup led by conservative nobles and the Queen Dowager shattered Struensee's grip on power. He was arrested, tried, and executed. Caroline Matilda was exiled. Christian, broken, silenced, and stripped of agency, lived on as a shadow king, locked in his palace, wandering the halls under supervision until his death in 1808. What remains is not proof, but pattern. Christian's deepest bond was not with his queen nor his advisors, but with the man who understood him and briefly ruled through him. Their relationship defies easy labels. Was it love? Was it manipulation? Was it care in a court that offered none? What's clear is that Struensee offered Christian something no other figure in his life did: presence, steadiness, a voice in the storm. And if their closeness left the court suspicious, perhaps that says more about the court than the king. But Christian wasn't the only royal whose affections drew whispers and resentment. In the court of the Habsburgs, another noble, Archduke Ludwig Victor, would shatter decorum not through power or politics, but through sheer audacity and a fondness for mirrors that reflected more than just vanity. 25. Archduke Ludwig Victor of Austria. In the glittering twilight of the Habsburg Empire, where everything sparkled except emotional honesty, Archduke Ludwig Victor, younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, became something of an open secret. He was royalty, certainly. He was cultured, theatrically stylish, and often impeccably dressed. But he was also something much more rare in the austere corridors of the Hofburg Palace, unapologetically himself. Born in 1842 into the most powerful royal family in Europe, Ludwig Victor was never meant to rule. He was the fourth son in a dynasty that already had emperors, military commanders, and sacrificial archdukes. While his elder brothers were groomed for governance and marriage alliances, Ludwig Victor was left to drift, and drift he did, but always in the direction of glitter, society, and scandal. From a young age, he made his inclinations clear. He had no interest in women, beyond their jewelry. No desire for power, unless it was theatrical, and no intention of following the script handed to him by court etiquette. He became known in Vienna not for his politics, but for his parties, salons, and a sharp tongue that could both charm and cut in a single conversation. The court tolerated him, barely. Franz Joseph, ever the portrait of cold dignity, reportedly found his brother's behavior embarrassing and unsuitable. But what exactly did that behavior involve? Ludwig Victor, while never publicly outed in modern terms, was known in Vienna for his preference for male company. This wasn't just gossip behind lace fans, it was an open reality. He was a regular figure at the city's bathhouses, where his presence was noted with fascination, amusement, and at times horror by the more conservative elite. Unlike other royals who maintained plausible deniability, Ludwig Victor made little effort to hide his preferences. In one infamous episode, often cited but rarely sourced with precision, He allegedly propositioned a young officer at a public bath and was slapped across the face in return. The incident became the talk of the city. For an ordinary noble, it might have meant exile or worse. For Ludwig Victor, it meant the same thing, just delayed slightly by royal blood. Eventually, even the Habsburgs had enough. Franz Joseph, weary of the constant embarrassment, exiled his brother to Schloss Klesheim, a Baroque palace near Salzburg. There, Ludwig Victor lived out the rest of his life in what was effectively gilded house arrest. But even in exile, he didn't disappear quietly. He transformed the estate into a private little kingdom of art, music, and, according to local law, a revolving door of handsome companions. He was patron to painters, musicians, and young men with conveniently undefined employment. He staged private performances. He filled rooms with mirrors. He held on to his titles, his fortune, and his stubborn refusal to apologize for existing the way he did. His correspondence, though discreet, suggests a man who knew exactly who he was and didn't care to pretend otherwise, even if it meant permanent removal from the imperial spotlight. Ludwig Victor died in 1919, just 1 year after the fall of the Habsburg Empire. The monarchy that once silenced and sequestered him was gone, dissolved into the ashes of World War I. And in a poetic twist of history, he may have outlived not only his family's reign, but also their carefully constructed illusions of control. His story is remarkable not for what it proves, but for how openly it challenged a system that thrived on quiet conformity. He didn't fit, he didn't want to, he didn't pretend. And that, in the gold-leafed, etiquette-choked world of 19th century monarchy, was as revolutionary as any war. But Ludwig Victor wasn't the first royal to wrestle with roles the world didn't make room for. Long before him, in the sun-baked temples of ancient Egypt, another ruler was sculpting a life outside the binary, not just in who he loved, but in how he saw the very structure of divinity. Because Akhenaten didn't just change the gods, he changed the body, the image, the language, and perhaps somewhere behind the draped linen and sun discs, he changed the rules of love too. 26. Pharaoh Akhenaten of Egypt. Pharaoh Akhenaten didn't just rule Egypt, he tried to rewrite it. Religion, art, language, even the shape of royal bodies on temple walls, nothing escaped his reformist touch. Ruling from approximately 1353 to 1336 BCE during the 18th dynasty, Akhenaten stands as one of the most controversial and mystifying figures in all of Egyptian history. He abolished a 1,000-year-old pantheon in favor of a single sun god. He moved the capital to a brand new city in the desert. He shattered conventions so thoroughly that future rulers tried to erase his name from stone. And yet, among the many mysteries that linger, his theology, his health, his succession, one persists like a heat shimmer off the Nile. Who or what did Akhenaten love? The traditional answer is Queen Nefertiti, a famously beautiful woman whose name still echoes in museums around the world. She appeared beside him in art with an unprecedented level of prominence and tenderness. They had daughters. They ruled side by side. For many, she was his great co-sovereign and possibly co-revolutionary. But then there's Smenkhare. If you've never heard of him, you're not alone. He's one of the most elusive and poorly documented figures in ancient Egypt, and somehow possibly one of its most consequential. His name surfaces briefly late in Akhenaten's reign. Some sources suggest he ruled alongside the pharaoh as co-regent. Others say he may have taken the throne after Akhenaten's death, reigning briefly before the young Tutankhamun stepped in. But it's not Smenkhare's politics that fuel speculation. It's his proximity, his imagery, and his remarkable resemblance to Akhenaten himself, sometimes so close that scholars debate whether they were brothers, lovers, or merely political constructs of the same theological machine. In a now fragmentary wall painting discovered in the royal tomb at Amarna, two nearly identical male figures are shown embracing and crowned, possibly kissing. One is labeled Akhenaten, the other Smenkhare. The interpretation is debated. Some say the figure is misidentified, that it's actually Nefertiti or even a divine double. Others argue the image suggests a closeness that defies dynastic tradition. Egyptologists have long argued over Akhenaten's own gender presentation. In stark contrast to his predecessors, who had themselves depicted in muscular, heroic poses, Akhenaten appears in temple carvings with elongated limbs, wide hips, soft bellies, and sometimes even visible breasts. His facial features are exaggerated, full lips, sloping eyes, and a long, narrow skull. Was this a medical condition, Marfan syndrome perhaps, or was it intentional, an artistic rejection of traditional masculinity? Some scholars believe Akhenaten was portraying himself as a divine composite, both male and female, reflecting his belief that the sun god Aten encompassed all life. Others suggest that this ambiguity may have been personal as much as theological. His poetry to attain is filled with gentle, intimate language. Gone is the distant, thunderous pantheon of old. In its place is a god of light, warmth, and closeness. The boundary between divine and personal, between royal and emotional, blurs again and again in Akhenaten's world. It's not hard to imagine a pharaoh who saw love, whether for a man or a woman, as an extension of his religious revolution, radical, private, and morally transcendent. Still, we are left with fragments. No diaries, no letters, just stone, dust, and speculation. Smenkhkare vanishes as quickly as he appeared, and Nefertiti, once a queen of unmatched prominence, disappears from the record near the end of Akhenaten's reign. Did she die? Was she erased? Or did she become Smenkhkare in a dynastic sleight of hand? It's possible, too, that Akhenaten's story doesn't involve a single clear romantic narrative at all. Perhaps it was a spectrum of affection, identity, and desire that defied the strict categories of ancient politics or modern curiosity. Perhaps he wasn't interested in defining himself in ways the gods hadn't already shattered. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt quickly reversed nearly everything he'd done. The old gods returned. His new city was abandoned. His name was scratched out of monuments. The theological revolution was over. But the personal mystery remained. We may never know exactly whom Akhenaten loved or how. What we do know is that he left behind a vision of the world where love, power, body, and spirit refused to sit in separate rooms. And for a ruler whose every statue seemed designed to provoke confusion, perhaps that was the point. Still, if Akhenaten blurred the line between the human and divine, the next monarch played an altogether more dangerous game, one involving backroom whispers, forbidden uniforms, and shadows cast over a throne in 20th century Spain. King Alfonso XIII may not have restructured religion, but he left behind secrets hidden in plain sight, especially in the eyes of the men who saluted him a little too quickly and stayed just a little too long. 27. King Alfonso XIII of Spain. In the glittering photographs of early 20th century royalty, King Alfonso XIII of Spain cuts a striking figure. Tall, upright, unmistakably regal, with the polished moustache and crisp uniform of a man born into monarchy and seemingly built for rule. Crowned king at birth in 1886 and assuming full royal power at 16, Alfonso projected the confident image of a modernizing monarch straddling two worlds, old Spain, still cloaked in Catholic tradition, and the new century humming with technology, politics, and unrest. But behind the medals and military formality lay another Spain, one of salon whispers, private correspondence, and closed-door clubs where uniforms came off and masks often slipped. And it's in this quiet shadow world that Alfonso's personal life starts to blur, particularly when it comes to his relationship with the men who orbited his court, often closer than protocol strictly required. To the public, Alfonso was a king who married well, to Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, a British royal and granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Their union was meant to solidify Spain's image on the international stage, projecting unity, progress, and dynastic strength. Behind palace doors, though, the marriage was turbulent. The couple had 7 children, but their relationship was deeply strained, in part due to personal tragedy. Their eldest son was born with haemophilia, and 2 others would eventually die young. Court insiders also noted emotional distance, affairs, and a mutual dissatisfaction that became impossible to ignore. While Victoria Eugenie's alleged infidelities with male courtiers drew attention, Alfonso's own relationships became the stuff of more hushed speculation, particularly his close, often intense friendships with certain young military officers. These men were frequently promoted rapidly, granted personal access, and seen accompanying the king at social events that blurred the line between formality and familiarity. One such figure was Captain Ramon Franco, the famed aviator and brother of future dictator Francisco Franco. Though there is no definitive evidence of a romantic relationship between Alfonso and Franco, the closeness of their bond, the privileges extended, and the emotional language used in letters between Alfonso and several young officers has prompted generations of speculation. Some court chroniclers, carefully avoiding direct accusations, referred to aesthetic friendships or refined affections, terms often used as veiled references to same-sex intimacy within aristocratic circles. Complicating matters further is Alfonso's documented interest in art, fashion, and aesthetics, areas which, at the time, were stereotypically tied to gendered assumptions about masculinity. While this alone proves nothing, when combined with his private circle of military protégés, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore and impossible to confirm. What gives this rumor particular historical weight is the broader culture of Spain at the time. Despite its outward conservatism, early 20th century Spanish aristocracy was rife with unspoken understandings, especially among the upper class, where discretion was not just a preference but a survival strategy. Homosexuality, though criminalized and officially condemned by both church and state, was quietly tolerated so long as it remained invisible. Alfonso's alleged relationships never rose to the level of scandal, but they were never far from the edges of court gossip either. Later in life, Alfonso's regime began to crack under political and social pressure. After a series of crises, including military defeats, economic instability, and growing unrest, he fled the country in 1931 when the Second Spanish Republic was declared. He never abdicated formally, but lived the rest of his life in exile, watching as his country moved towards civil war and his monarchy teetered on the brink of permanent dissolution. He died in Rome in 1941, just as fascism was reshaping Europe, and his legacy was inherited not by his son, but by a movement that would install his descendant, Juan Carlos, decades later under a very different kind of regime. Alfonso's memory, like so many royals on this list, is not defined by clear evidence or confessions, but by quiet contradictions. A monarch of ceremony and secrecy. A man who kept his crown polished and his heart sealed, not because it was empty, but perhaps because it was full of the kind of feelings his kingdom didn't allow. And if Alfonso's story reads like a murmur through marble halls, the next ruler's tale begins in even more distant lands, where a Polish throne met a French flirtation and a familiar name. Henri returned for an encore. Only this time, the scandals of Paris followed him to Krakow. 28. King Henry III of Poland, also Henri III of France. Before he wore French lace in the salons of Paris, Henri of Valois wore Polish armour on the plains of Krakow, albeit uncomfortably and with less enthusiasm than anyone hoped. Crowned King Henry of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania in 1573, he lasted barely a year before fleeing his adopted throne in the dead of night to claim a shinier one back home, the crown of France. But even in that brief Polish chapter, the rumours followed him. Or perhaps they arrived before he did. Henry was never just a king, he was a spectacle. The fourth son of Catherine de' Medici, raised in the volatile climate of the French wars of religion, Henri grew up surrounded by intrigue, anxiety, and the creeping awareness that the role he was meant to play was already too small for the costume he planned to wear. By the time he arrived in Poland to assume his unexpected title, the Polish nobles were already whispering about his fashion, his mannerisms, and, most persistently, his favourites. Polish chroniclers described their new king with a mixture of fascination and dismay. He wore perfume, he curled his hair, he brought an entourage of impeccably dressed young Frenchmen who spoke little Polish and seemed more interested in court theatrics than statecraft. These companions, later referred to by the French term mignons, the darlings, were not merely servants or advisors. They were Henri's emotional entourage, and possibly more. Even before Henry's ascension to the French throne, his reputation for surrounding himself with young men of delicate beauty, sharp wit, and suspiciously fast political ascents had taken root. In Poland, it came across as foreign, decadent, and perhaps dangerous. The nobles, deeply Catholic and intensely proud of their egalitarian Schlachter, nobility, viewed the French courtiers with a mix of disdain and moral panic. The political damage was swift. Henri's failure to fully engage with the customs and expectations of his new kingdom, including his apparent disinterest in marrying a Polish noblewoman, quickly alienated his base. When word arrived that his brother, King Charles IX of France, had died, Henri wasted no time. He slipped out of the country disguised as a woman, according to some sources, though this may have been a touch of poetic revenge by later chroniclers. Back in France, as King Henri III, the patterns continued. His mignons gained lands, titles, and dangerous enemies. Their effeminate style, theatrical flourishes, and brazen intimacy with the king ignited pamphlet wars and sermons across France. Enemies accused Henri of sodomy, a charge never proven but widely repeated. The mignons fought duels in the streets, threw lavish parties, and sometimes died defending the king's honour. Henri defended them fiercely, publicly and emotionally. Too emotionally, some said. The Polish chapter of Henri's life is often treated as a footnote, but it offers something unique, a glimpse of how his relationships were perceived outside of his native France, where the French court, despite its scandal, had grown somewhat numb to royal eccentricity. The Polish court, built on a fragile elective monarchy and strict expectations of masculine decorum, responded with shock. Henri's reputation as a king who favoured male companionship didn't begin in Paris. It just found more scandalous language there. Henri III died in 1589, stabbed by a Catholic fanatic who saw him as a threat to both crown and faith. By then, many of his mignons were already dead, victims of political purges and court vendettas. His legacy, like his wardrobe, was impossible to fold neatly. A king who embodied contradiction, devoutly religious and accused of vice, politically shrewd yet emotionally impulsive, beloved by some, despised by many, remembered more for his companions than his campaigns. But if Henri's story dances on the edge of truth and theatre, the next emperor slips entirely into rumour, because in the case of Paul II of Russia, the whispers weren't about elegance or poetry. They were about guardsmen, uniforms, and a ruler whose affections may have cost him more than just his crown. 29. Emperor Paul II of Russia. In the long, snow-laced line of Russian tsars, emperors, and autocrats, Paul II tends to vanish somewhere in the frost, a name remembered less for empire building and more for the extravagant whispers that swirled through the gilded corridors of the Kremlin during his reign. But dig beneath the surface, and what emerges is a ruler whose brief time on the throne left more questions than answers, especially when it came to his personal life. Born in 1754 as Pavel Petrovich, Paul was the son of Empress Maria Fyodorovna and the infamous Emperor Paul I, whose own reign ended in assassination. The legacy of paranoia, political repression, and eccentricity shadowed Paul II from the start. Officially, he became Tsar in 1796 and ruled until his unexpected death in 1801. But in this segment, we're focusing on Grand Duke Paul Petrovich as a younger man before he ever reached the throne, when he was already being talked about in the salons of St. Petersburg, not for military conquests, but for his companions. The Russian court in the late 18th century was a strange theatre of European enlightenment and deep-seated superstition. Image mattered more than substance. Public virtue and private vice danced in elaborate disguise. It was a court where mirrors were everywhere, but not always for seeing clearly. And Paul, he was surrounded from an early age by men in polished uniforms who looked alarmingly similar. Young, handsome, devoted, and fiercely loyal. Court observers noted this pattern. Some described Paul's guards as unusually attentive to their master. Others remarked that the emperor seemed overly attached to certain members of his personal regiment. Among the most famous of these companions was Ivan Kutaisov, the son of a Turkish barber who rose rapidly through the ranks, eventually becoming master of the stables and master of much more, depending on which courtier you believed. Kutaisov's ascent was meteoric and inexplicable by normal standards. He lacked noble blood, formal education, or political allies. What he did have was constant proximity to Paul, an intuitive understanding of how to soothe the emperor's erratic moods, and a reputation for elegance that rivaled any prince. Rumors swelled. Was it a court favorite scenario, akin to Louis XIV and his chosen gentlemen, or James I with his Dukes of Buckingham? Or was it simply a monarch projecting his vulnerabilities onto anyone who offered loyalty in a palace full of knives? There's no definitive proof of a romantic or sexual relationship between Paul and Kutaisov or any other male favorite. But the emotional dependency, the excessive promotions, and the degree of physical closeness was enough for Russian gossip to take over where the records fall silent. What truly fanned the rumors, though, was Paul's court itself. The pageantry, the uniforms, the obsessive love of military drills and parades. He required his guards to wear skin-tight uniforms, to march with rigid beauty, to become not just soldiers, but a living art installation. One visiting diplomat described the court as more theatre than governance, more costume than policy. Paul's fascination with masculine appearance, order, and presentation was constant and consuming. He personally designed military uniforms, often favoring aesthetics over practicality. Officers who pleased him with their appearance were rewarded. Those who didn't were dismissed. This obsession with presentation, alongside his intense relationships with young men of his inner circle, created a profile that was ripe for speculation and impossible to confirm. In 1801, Paul was assassinated in a palace coup led by disgruntled nobles and military officers, including some from the very guard he cherished. His son, Alexander I, took the throne. Kutaisov remained at court, but never again rose so high. Paul II's legacy is thin on achievements, thick with questions. His reign was short, his relationships enigmatic, and his affections buried under layers of imperial ceremony and posthumous editing. But in those tightly tailored uniforms and carefully choreographed suit friendships, something quietly defiant may have lived. And from the shadowed halls of the Winter Palace, we turn now to Versailles, to a queen whose scandals have been immortalized in pamphlets and propaganda, but whose deepest secrets may have passed between the hands of another woman behind silk fans and drawn curtains. 30. Queen Marie Antoinette of France. Marie Antoinette's name has long been shorthand for decadence, a queen immortalized in powdered wigs, towering cakes, and that infamous, though apocryphal, line, "Let them eat cake." But behind the Versailles legend, the gossip-soaked pamphlets, and the revolution that swallowed her whole, there lingers a subtler, stranger question, one not just about diamonds or dresses, but about love, specifically the nature of her relationship with another woman, the Princess de Lamballe. Born in 1755 as an Austrian archduchess, Marie Antoinette arrived in France at the age of 14, a diplomatic bride offered to seal the alliance between two empires. Her marriage to the future Louis XVI was chilly and awkward from the start. He was shy, introverted, and mechanically devoted to locks and hunting. She was outgoing, charming, and soon deeply frustrated. The lack of intimacy in their marriage was public knowledge by court standards, whispered in salons and dissected in satirical plays. Enter Marie-Thérèse Louise of Savoy, better known as the Princess de Lamballe. She was everything the court adored, refined, beautiful, well-bred, and just enough older than Marie Antoinette to seem maternal, yet not enough to be matronly. The Queen latched onto her with a kind of fierce emotional intensity that startled the court. The princess was appointed superintendent of the Queen's household, the highest female position at Versailles, and was almost constantly by the Queen's side. They wrote to each other with affection that reads, even centuries later, as unmistakably intimate. Marie Antoinette referred to Lamballe as "my dear heart," "my sweet friend," and sometimes signed letters with passionate flourishes that seemed to stretch the conventions of even the most effusive 18th century correspondence. They embraced frequently in public, kissed on the cheek, held hands. In court culture, such displays were not inherently shocking, but the consistency and intensity raised eyebrows, especially when combined with Marie Antoinette's decision to give Lamballe personal privileges that angered other nobles, including the infamous Duchesse de Polignac, who would eventually displace Lamballe as the Queen's closest companion. Still, Lamballe remained loyal. Through political storms, personal humiliations, and social exile, she stayed close, defending Marie Antoinette even as revolutionary sentiment darkened around them. What began as affectionate friendship had, by then, become part of a much more dangerous narrative, because in the final years of the monarchy, Marie Antoinette became the subject of vicious libels, underground pamphlets filled with pornographic fantasies, political venom, and lurid accusations. These pamphlets didn't stop at criticizing her Austrian heritage or supposed extravagance. They attacked her sexuality. Many accused her of having affairs with women, with the Princess de Lamballe at the top of the list. The Queen was portrayed as a depraved seductress, leading orgies in the Petit Trianon, corrupting court women, and abandoning her royal duties for hedonistic pleasures. None of these accusations were supported by evidence. Most were almost certainly propaganda, designed to destroy public sympathy and inflame revolutionary anger. But their intensity and the consistency with which Lamballe was named reflects something deeper, the fear of female intimacy that stepped outside expected norms, especially when power was involved. When the revolution reached its fever pitch, Lamballe was arrested. Unlike other courtiers who fled, she stayed, convinced that loyalty would protect her. It didn't. In 1792, she was murdered during the September massacres, her body desecrated by a mob so enraged they placed her head on a pike and paraded it outside Marie Antoinette's prison window. The Queen, upon seeing it, reportedly fainted. Marie Antoinette followed her friend to the grave less than a year later, guillotined as the symbol of everything the revolution sought to erase. She left behind children, a crumbling monarchy, and a legacy woven as much from rumor as reality. Was she in love with Lamballe? History cannot say. But what we do know is this: theirs was a connection that endured when convenience failed, a friendship that outlived palace favor, a bond that, in life and in death, unsettled a world terrified of women who chose each other. And with that, the list closes. 30 rulers across centuries and continents, each one carrying in silence, spectacle, or suspicion the weight of desires their world could not name. Some found love, some lost power. Most were never allowed both.